Kant does not spend nearly as much time talking about the second and third propositions as the first proposition, and so neither will we. The second proposition of morality states that an action done from duty, so these morally praiseworthy actions that the first proposition we're talking about, an action done from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose to be attained by it, but in the maxim according to which the action is determined. What he's getting at here, focus on two things. There are two things that are kind of unclear here, right? We know we've seen this terminology, an action done from duty has its moral worth. We've seen all that in the first proposition. I trust that we can understand what that's getting at or what that means. But now we have two different things that follow that aren't entirely clear. The purpose to be attained by it, what does that mean? And then in the maxim according to which the action is determined, what does that mean? The purpose to be attained by it is something like what he's referring to are the consequences of the action. The purpose to be attained by the action is the results, the consequences, the effects of the action. The maxim according to which the action is determined, that's something like the intention behind the action, the motivation, the intention behind the action. And so what the second proposition says is that an action done from duty, which is morally praiseworthy, right? Its worth, its value lies not in the results of the action, not in what the action brings about in the world. It rests in the will, in the intention of the person doing the action. What matters is the intention, not so much the effects or the results, the consequences. The moral worth doesn't depend on what actually ends up happening, doesn't depend on whether or not the action is successful, but it simply depends upon the volition, the willing, the intention behind the action. That's Kant's idea. What really matters is the intention, the will behind an action, not the results, not the effects of the action. And so to go back, say, to the friend of mankind example, the moral worth when that person is kind of miserable, right? And they're doing it anyways. And so, the person who's been clouded over by sorrow, but nonetheless goes and helps out people. The moral worth of their action doesn't lie in the fact that people are now fed. That would be the consequences. That would be the action being successful. That would be the effects of the action. That's not what makes that action morally praiseworthy. What makes it morally praiseworthy is the intention behind the action, the maxim according to which the action is determined, right? The will of the person. It's because the person is doing this because it's the right thing to do. That's what makes the action morally praiseworthy. That's what gives it moral worth. Now, one implication of the second proposition, which is basically just a restatement of the second proposition, but the implication, these morally worthy actions, they have their value in the action itself, not in what they bring about. There's something about the action itself that is valuable. Their value, their worth kind of is in the very action itself or in the maxim of the action itself, not in the results or consequences or ends that the action brings about. Now, I stress this implication again, just like I did with the first proposition, because we're going to see this come back later. Third proposition of morality. This one's a little bit harder, I think, to wrap your mind around when it's first stated. He says something like, duty is the necessity of an action done out of respect for law. Or another way it's translated, to have a duty is to be required to act a certain way out of respect for law. Duty is the necessity of an action done out of respect for law. The idea is something like this. What's distinctive about motivation by duty is that it consists of bare respect for lawfulness. To be motivated by duty, to do something because it's the right thing to do, is to be motivated by respect for the law. That's what he's saying. And I think the easiest way to see something like this is to consider non-moral duties that we might have. So Kant is ultimately interested in moral duties and moral and the moral law, right? Moral respect. That's ultimately what he's interested in. But I think what he's saying here applies to other kinds of duties as well. And I think by focusing on some of these other duties, we get a better sense of what he's getting at. So, for example, we can focus on civic duties and being motivated by your civic duty and being motivated by respect for the civic law, so to speak. And let's choose a specific example of a civic duty. So, a civic law, right? Let's say paying your taxes. Paying your taxes is something required by the law. April 15th, you got to make sure it's in or whatever, right? And if you don't, they'll fine you. And if you don't pay those fines, they'll give you more fines. And if you don't pay those fines and so on, eventually they'll just haul you off to jail, right? Okay, so we have there's a law saying that we have to do that. Otherwise, we get punished. Okay. You could be motivated in one of two ways to follow that law. So let's take me on the one hand. Me, let's say I'm not very patriotic at all. I'm just a average guy or something. I pay my taxes. Why? Well, because I don't want the hassle. I don't want them giving me a big fine. I don't want to go to jail. And so, fine, whatever. I'll pay my taxes. I'll send off the money, and that's fine. And just leave me alone. It's the law. Fine. I just don't want the hassle. I don't want to go to jail. In that case, what Kant would say, following this third proposition, is that I'm not really motivated by duty in that case. I'm motivated by inclination. I don't want to go to jail. I don't want the hassle. Right? And so I pay my taxes. That's fine. I'm not a bad person for all that, right? I'm not motivated out of respect for the law, though, is what he would say. I'm not paying my taxes because I respect the law. I'm paying my taxes because I don't want to go to jail. I don't want a big, huge fine. I don't want any of that hassle. By contrast, you might have somebody who respects the law of the land, respects the United States and their laws and their legal institutions and the project that they're engaged upon, right? Someone who's, say, more patriotically minded. And this person, they might not really have a second thought about being punished or fined or thrown in jail for not paying their taxes. They might think, well, look, I am a citizen of this country. This country needs tax revenues in order to function, in order to do what it does. I'm happy to provide my taxes, to pay my taxes. I respect the law. I respect the law of the United States, the civic law. And so I pay my taxes out of respect for that law. It's my civic obligation. It's my civic duty to pay my taxes. And so I'm going to perform my civic duty. I'm going to be a good citizen, and I will pay my taxes to be a good citizen. Something like that. That would be motivation by duty. That would be someone who is acting out of respect for the law, right? That's someone who's motivated by their civic duty, acting out of respect for the civic law, the federal law to pay your taxes, right? And so I trust you can see that contrast. And so what we would say, kind of following what we've been looking at, we might say that more patriotic, civic-minded person is, civically praiseworthy. There's civic worth in their actions. Whereas paying my taxes, there's no, you wouldn't praise me as a citizen for that. Yeah. Something like that is the idea. And so what Kant is saying is same idea applies in morality. To be motivated by duty is to do the right thing or avoid the wrong thing because that's out of respect for the moral law, because that's what the moral law says. The moral law says don't commit suicide. And so I'm refraining from committing suicide because that's what the moral law says. Out of respect for that moral law, I'm refraining, right? That would be motivation by duty. That's what the third proposition is saying. One issue that it raises, and so I've used this example kind of knowingly, is that there are different kinds of duties, right? So we can contrast moral duties and the moral law with, say, civic duties and the civic law. And we wouldn't talk about familial law really, but familial duties, work duties, and so on, the kinds of things that you're expected, your obligations in the family, your obligations in the workplace, and so on. Kant, when he's discussing this third proposition, contrasts moral duties and the moral law with all of these other kinds of duties. And what he stresses is that the moral law is different. It's distinct from all of these other kinds of laws and all of these other kinds of duties in the following way. The civic law, just choose one example, right? The law of the United States can be opted out of. You don't like paying taxes to the American government? You don't have to. You can opt out of that law. You can get out from under the commands of that law. Go somewhere else. Move to Canada, right? Then the law of the United States, the tax law in this particular case, is no longer binding on you. You've opted out of it. You've gotten out from under it. Civic laws are like that. You can opt out of them. Familial laws, maybe, I don't know, whatever, ignore that. Work laws, work obligations, they're certainly like that, right? Quit your job. Then whatever obligations you have, in as much as you're an employee of this or that place, are no longer binding on you. Every kind of law, every kind of duty that we have can be opted out of, except for the moral law, except for our moral duties. You cannot opt out of them. It doesn't matter where you move, doesn't matter who you join with. Nothing that you can do can get you out from under the moral law. The moral law is always binding on you. You cannot get out from under it. You cannot opt out of it. This implication of the third proposition, or this idea that Kant discusses when he's discussing the third proposition, again, is going to come up later when we turn to book 2 of the groundwork.